All right, folks, welcome back to the channel. I've just completed installation of the Termignoni Slipon exhaust. And so I thought what I would do in this video is to give you 6 tips on the installation to make your life a little easier. 3 of them deal with removal of the old exhaust, and then 3 of them deal with installing the new exhaust. All right, so let's shift our attention to the old exhaust. And so here's tip number 1, and that is go ahead and remove this outer cover. There are about 4 or 5 bolts like this that hold them, and you're going to be pounding with a dowel. So you're going to be pounding this area and this area, and then this area over here you're going to have to come in from the other side. So it just makes sense, make your life easier by just removing this, and then you can always put it back on if you're going to sell it or whatever it is. So that's tip number 1, is go ahead and remove this, and it's going to make your life easier, especially because at some point you might have to hammer this just with the rubber mallet without the dowel. And so again, you don't want to destroy this if you don't have to. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is that these gaskets over here, they have extreme amount of friction, and they're very, very difficult to pry out. And so what you want to do, and what I did and made my life easier, is to use copious amounts of WD-40. So I've got this, right? And I've got a nozzle, sort of a jet spray nozzle. And so I put a lot of WD-40 in this area here, and then this area here. So the more you spray before you pound it with a dowel or pound it with a rubber mallet, the easier your job is going to become. So don't forget the WD-40. Use it generously right from the get-go. Okay. And the third tip, with respect to removal of the old exhaust, is actually a tip that applies both to the installation of the new exhaust as well as the removal of the old. And that is, I would highly recommend that you remove the rear sets, all right, on both sides. So that's going to make your job and your life much easier, because you're going to have to get into the nooks and crannies, remove bolts, you remove springs. So I'm not saying that this cannot be done without removing the rear sets, but especially if you're planning to replace the rear sets in any case, like I have, moved from the stock to the Gillis, this whole area is just open. So remove the old rear sets and don't put the new ones back until the new exhaust is completed, then come back and install the new rear sets. So that's tip number 3. So again, number 1 is to remove the aluminum kind of cover. Number 2 is to use copious amounts of WD-40, preferably with one of these jet sprays. And the third thing is, if you can, if you're comfortable doing it, then remove the rear sets. If you cannot, that's okay. You can still do everything, but it will make your life easier. All right, then a couple of tips with respect to the installation of the Termignoni. Number 1 is, after you install the right-hand side, and that's what's recommended, that you install the right-hand side first. It says go ahead and torque it down, and I would recommend that you don't torque it down. Just leave the bolts, hand tighten maybe at best. So some of the bolts have to be threaded with a nut, and others you simply have to, the hole itself has a thread. So whatever the case may be, install the Termignoni, and then slip the bolt through the holes after they've aligned. And if there's a nut that needs to be fastened in the back, then go ahead and hand kind of tight the nuts. But after both sides have been installed and all the holes have been aligned, you can come back and tighten the nuts and bolts to the appropriate torque specification. So that again is going to make your life much easier. So that's tip number 1 as far as the installation is concerned, right? Tip number 2 is that this gap is very, very tight. So the gap from the pipe coming down and this gap here. Now you're seeing that this is right about I'd say a millimeter or so, and honestly it was even less than a millimeter. Okay, and I was initially thinking that I'm going to have to put some kind of a heat shield over there to prevent the two sides from rubbing against each other and causing damage. But what I did instead, and this is your tip, is that when I installed that bolt over there, I put an extra 2 washers so that I was able to push this side of the exhaust a little away. All right, so that's tip number 2 is I actually found a longer bolt, and so I used a longer bolt, and that's a self-locking nut you see over there, and you'll see that on the right hand side of the bracket I've got a couple of extra washers, and what I'm doing is I'm creating a little extra space so that these two sides, they don't touch, because if you don't, at least when I install these, those things had less than a millimeter, and I know once I start the bike and run it, the vibration is going to cause this, over there to touch the downpipe, and yeah, that's not good. So that's tip number 2. And then tip number 3 is the same tip as the tip for removing the old exhaust, and that is, if you can, go ahead and get these rear sets out of the way. So again, if you happen to be changing rear sets, then plan to do the Termignoni installation and the rear sets on the same day. If not, again, you can do it. It's not like a fatal kind of a flaw if you don't remove the rear sets, but your life is going to be much easier. So those are the 3 tips, and I think if you follow them and just follow the instructions, that